Go ahead and, okay, great. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this very important discussion hosted by the Gold Institute for International Strategy. Today, we're going to dive into one of the most critical geopolitical flashpoints of our time, the South China Sea. And, this region, of course, is not just about territorial disputes, it's a battleground for influence, resources, and the future of global trade and stability, with over $3 trillion in goods passing through these waters annually, accounting for about 21% of the global trade. Yet tensions are at an all-time high, with China asserting expansive claims, there's employing gray zone tactics, and of course, challenging international law that is ever-changing. So ASEAN's response remains fragmented, of course, raising questions about the bloc's unity and ability to act as a counterweight. So to help us complex this very complex topic, we are joined by three distinguished, exceptional experts. They truly bring unique insights from the field of economics, strategy, and geopolitics, and I'm thrilled to introduce them shortly. Today's conversation will, of course, explore the implications of China's actions for ASEAN, the global balance of power, and the stability of one of the world's most vital maritime corridors. With that said, I'd like to make an introduction to all of our speakers here today. We have Mr. David P. Goldman, who is an economic strategist and author. David Goldman is a renowned economic strategist, author with a deep understanding of the interplay between economic policy and geopolitical strategy. His analysis of China's economic maneuvers has been instrumental in understanding the country's ambitions in the South China Sea. Goldman writes from a Judeo-Christian perspective, often exploring themes such as the morality of nations, Western secularism, Asian cultural challenges, and the rigidity of Islam in adapting to modernity. In 2020, Goldman was appointed as deputy editor of business at Asia Times. He has previously served as a partner at Yunfeng Financial, an investment bank based in Hong Kong, which was eventually acquired by Jack Ma. David Goldman continues to advise CEOs and institutional investors worldwide. He's a prolific writer and a regular contributor to the Wall Street Journal, Claremont Review of Books, Law and Liberty, Tablet Magazine, and First Things, where he served as a senior editor from 2009 to 2011. You can follow him on X, formerly Twitter, at David P. Goldman. Next, we have Stephen J. Yates, Senior Research Fellow for China and National Security Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Congratulations on that as well.
Thank you.
Of course, Stephen Yates brings a wealth of experience in national security and policy analysis, particularly concerning China's military and strategic ambitions. He is an American political advisor, government official, and academic with a distinguished career spanning national security, international affairs, and political leadership. He served as Deputy National Advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney from 2001 to 2005, and most recently as President of Radio Free Asia. He's also fluent in Mandarin and has also advised on U.S.-Asia relations, global political risk, and conservative policy, founding the DC International Advisory in 2006 to counsel businesses and governments. And I also had the pleasure of meeting Stephen over a decade ago while we were both guests on Buck Sexton's show. And you can follow him on X as well, at Yates Comms. And last but not least, of course, we have Gordon G. Chang. He is a journalist, lawyer, political commentator, and author. I had the pleasure of being on a panel with him over 10 years ago at CPAC as well regarding China. Gordon Chang is one of the most respected voices on U.S.-China relations. He is the author of Plan Red, China's Project to Destroy America, which was released on October 1st, and congratulations on that as well. His other works include The Coming Collapse of China and The Great U.S.-China Tech War, and China is Going to War. He is a columnist at Newsweek and writes regularly for The Hill and other publications. Mr. Chang has also given briefings at the National Intelligence Council, Central Intelligence Agency, State Department, and the Pentagon. Chang has also appeared before the House Committee on Foreign Affairs and the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. He frequently appears on Fox News, Fox Business, Newsmax TV, MSNBC, and CNN. He lived and worked in China and Hong Kong for almost 2 decades, practicing law, and he served 2 terms as a trustee of Cornell University. You can follow him on X as well, formerly Twitter, at Gordon G. Chang. So I'd love to, in the first, topic, navigating rising tensions, China's influence in the South China Sea. I want to explore the geopolitical, legal, and economic dimensions of China's, assertiveness in the South China Sea and its implications for ASEAN, global trade, and regional stability. Before I do that, I'd love to first allow for each of the panelists to, just, up to 2 minutes, just to introduce themselves and to the audience. I'd love it if we could, start with you, David.
Asia Times tries to be an objective source. Our opinion column spans the entire spectrum, and we've done our best to be ahead of the news. In terms of the South China Sea, there are some remarkable developments, particularly in China-Indonesian relations, which suggest to me that China may be moving away from its default position, which is bullying its neighbors, to bribing them. And China has always been more effective at bribing than bullying, which would portend an increase in Chinese influence. One of the main topics we've addressed over years is the change in military technology and how important this is for great power relations, particularly the advantage to the offense in missile technology. China now has thousands of anti-ship missiles and can produce very large numbers of conventional cruise missiles per week, which means the home theater advantage to a land power with a large number of anti-ship missiles overwhelms any possible expeditionary force. So the advantage on the military side is also going to China. That, to me, suggests some radical improvements in our game. Otherwise, China is going to make the South China Sea into a Chinese lake.
Well, thank you for that intro. I just want to add to that, if I may. There's been a very impressive Chinese EV maker, Xpeng, which revealed a $280,000 land aircraft carrier, which is pretty awesome. I don't know if you've seen it, but
I've got to get me one of those.
It's so cool. Absolutely. So you're definitely right. They've taken a different approach. I'd love to now turn it over to Gordon to give some opening remarks as well. Then I'm going to go to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Adele. And it's great being on with both David and Stephen. China's been engaged, as we all know, in extremely provocative activities in its peripheral seas and waters, especially the South China Sea. The Biden State Department has issued 12 written warnings that the United States is prepared to use force against China to discharge our obligations pursuant to our 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty with Manila. And President Biden has actually issued 3 oral warnings to the same effect. But China has continued on. And that tells us that although China may not have made the decision to go to war, it has certainly made the decision to risk war. And it's made the decision to risk war with American treaty allies, which means it is now prepared to kill Americans. This month, we have seen China being uncharacteristically quiet in the South China Sea, East China Sea. And that has led to questions, what's going on? We don't know whether China is reacting primarily to internal or external factors, but we also have to ask ourselves a question, and that is, when in history has a militant power engaged in a fast military buildup and not gone to war? Now, in the South China Sea, we do have ASEAN. We do have agreements such as the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and they can stop war. But these institutions and these agreements will be tested like never before. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Of course, we have a bit of a varying perspective from Mr. Goldman. And now I'd love to also open the floor to Stephen Yates for opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be in good company in this conversation. And this is a very important strategic area, one that oftentimes goes forgotten or neglected unless there's something that makes a headline in our own markets. But really, this is a very significant geography in terms of aggregate economic relevance. It is a crossroads of the world's major religions and a sizable population when counted in aggregate. The challenge that we've had for multiple decades is that the region does not act in aggregate. And to a degree, that has been an advantage for the People's Republic of China in encroaching upon what had been the rules and norms that were in play and widely accepted. And Beijing has been somewhat clever in one by one going and challenging each of these areas. And ASEAN as a bloc and the region generally has had a hard time holding together so that the gravity of all of these nations combined might balance some of the influence or expansionism that China was putting into the region. But as Gordon was accounting, I'm deeply troubled by the verbal warnings that our leaders have given over and over without real material consequences. I don't think the American people are hungry for a conflict, quite the opposite. At the same time, the amount of global trade on which we depend going through this region is strategically significant and not something our national interests can ignore. And China's very fantastical claims, very far from their own shores, would be essentially a controlling influence over whatever might pass through this strategic region. It would essentially have a veto over Europe, the Middle East, traffic to Asian significant economies, and for the United States and Asian allies transiting through this region back over to South Asia and the broader Middle East for trade. This is an immensely important area. So I think that the challenge before us is now with perhaps a different approach coming in the United States. Will there be a different approach to Xi Jinping personally by Donald Trump that maybe slows this rise in tensions? We can't know that in advance. History would suggest caution about that succeeding, but I think that might be tried. But our military and the defense supply chains of our allies have to be reinvigorated so that this burden is shared more effectively than it's been to date, in my estimation. But for opening, I think that we have a somewhat startling set of circumstances to have to deal with right now.
So this is,
Adele, could I jump in?
please, absolutely.
The single most interesting fact to me is that China's exports to ASEAN doubled between 2020 and 2023 from an annual rate of about $300 billion to $600 billion a year. To put that in perspective, we export $100 billion a year to ASEAN. So China is 6 times our weight in ASEAN's imports. And I think the amount of effort that China is putting into infrastructure in ASEAN, including a rail line that will eventually go down to Singapore, as well as telecommunications, rail, and so forth in Indonesia, are probably going to keep this going. Now, China has an existential economic interest in ASEAN. Its population is shrinking. It needs to have people work for its companies. It won't have enough in China. And ASEAN is a pool of nearly 700 million people who are disciplined, hardworking, can read a manual, reasonably well educated. So China wants to assimilate ASEAN into its greater economic zone, and it uses carrot and stick. The stick, of course, has gotten them into all kinds of trouble, not just with the Philippines, but with Vietnam, which had real dust-up with China in October. The most interesting development in years to me is that the new president of Indonesia, Prabowo, recognized the legitimacy of China's claims to the North Natuna Sea, adjacent to the South China Sea, in a public statement on November 11th. He talked about overlapping claims, which essentially says China has claims that have to be adjudicated, as opposed to the standard Indonesian position of the past, which is China has no business anywhere near that patch of water. It's ours, and to hell with them. This occurred right after China and Indonesia signed about $10 billion in new investment deals. So it strongly suggests itself that China is using the Belt and Road Initiative and its economic weight to buy off Indonesia with the new government coming in, as opposed to bullying them. And from our standpoint, that should be worrying, because the more China bullies, the more likely ASEAN countries are likely to come to us for help. The more China buys them off with exports and infrastructure, which we're not in position to compete with, they get the advantage. So I hope the new administration pays more attention, in concert with our allies like Japan, South Korea, Australia, and so forth, Germany. And India is not an ally. India is a sometime collaborator. But yes, with India, to try to compete with China effectively in this economic march through ASEAN, which they've been conducting so effectively. If we ignore it, we're going to gradually lose influence, and China will get it, because economics in that part of the world really is the most important thing for people.
So I kind of want to thank you for the very in-depth analysis. I'm wondering, of course, everyone here, I'm sure, has been advising people internationally in the lead up to the November election, with Trump won. Do you feel that insiders, let's say from China, if there's been any communication with them, kind of had an inkling that Trump would end up winning this election, and because of that, they kind of shifted to a more economic approach as opposed to the so-called bullying on the world stage, making a strategic shift away from that, knowing that
Yeah, this Indonesian stuff was in the works for a long time, so I don't think that can be attributable, but it's certainly the case, reading Chinese media, Chinese websites, and talking to Chinese policy influencers, that they are very cautious about provoking Donald Trump, and they want to see what's on offer and what the configuration is. So I think we will see more caution on China's part. I've been asked by Chinese, what should we do about Trump? And I've told them, just let him win, because letting him win is going to cost you a lot less than trying to make him lose.
Very sound advice. So I wanted to delve into a little bit of the legal and ethical challenges. There's actually, we're going to backshift a little bit. We're going to let's talk about the economic leverage and risks. I think it's a nice segue, right? So considering the vast difference, 600, billion versus 100 billion on China versus the US in terms of output investments in ASEAN and all over the world in that particular corridor, how does China exports? Thank you for that. How does China leverage its economic dominance to assert control over the South China Sea, particularly with ASEAN countries that are heavily dependent on Chinese trade? David, if I may ask.
The most important thing China is doing is building up a massive missile, aircraft, and submarine force, which can knock out any contender. As I was saying before, Adele, as we've seen, for example, in the Red Sea with the Houthis, anti-ship missiles are very nasty items. And if you've got thousands of them, you can overwhelm an expeditionary force simply because an American destroyer can only carry 100 interceptors in its hold. The logistics of the home theater advantage of having internal supply lines are overwhelmingly in favor of China. Plus, they're producing a lot of modern aircraft, which, as far as you know, are pretty good. And they've got a very large number of diesel-electric submarines, which make about as much noise as turning on a light bulb. So I think whether it's a mailed glove or a velvet glove, there's an iron fist underneath it. And they will not desist from doing this. They will assert their military dominance. And on the other hand, they'll say, if you play ball with us, there will be benefits for you. You'll get investment, you'll get trade, you'll get jobs, which you want. So you can choose whether you want us to do things that we don't want to do, like the mob used to say, or whether you want to get paid off.
This is great. So, Gordon, if I may jump to you for a moment, thank you for that. I love the analogy about whether it's a velvet glove or the other glove, it's an iron fist. It's a very, very good visual and very spot on. So, Gordon, I wanted to ask, regarding the, military and diplomatic strategies, China's gray zone tactics, right, such as constructing artificial islands, Spratly and others, deploying maritime militias, they have reshaped the strategic landscape, arguably, effectively, actually. How should, in your opinion, the US and its allies respond to these provocations?
Well, the US has a lot of friends in the region and indeed treaty allies who are very disturbed about China And even countries that are not our allies, take Indonesia, for instance, while they might have been saying nice things to China, their Coast Guard was chasing Chinese ships out of their waters in the last 3 weeks. And they've been very determined to do that. So clearly, countries do not want to give up territory to China. I think that the United States needs to back up its warnings, especially with regard to the Philippines. And we do need to show military force. We need to bring the U.S. Navy to Air Force into play at places like Scarborough Shoal, Sabina Shoal, Second Thomas Shoal. And if we do that, even though the Chinese think that they can sink everything, they probably will not want to do that for a lot of reasons. They've got so many internal problems right now. They are not, I think, at a point where they feel that they can take on the United States. The most important thing is for the United States and countries in the region to show China they are not intimidated. Because if you do that, then I think China will be reasonable. If you don't do that, China will continue to try to break apart these countries and to dominate what we call the global commons. If the United States has had any consistent foreign policy over the course of our history, it's been the defense of that global commons, and we can't afford to give it up now. People may say, well, this is risky and dangerous, but I think the point is that after 3 decades of misguided China policy, yes, everything going forward is going to be risky and dangerous. And the most risky and dangerous position of all is to continue those policies that have gotten us into this situation in the first place.
So yeah, effectively, it's time to have the State Department, for example, kind of veer away from the Cold War era tactics that kind of they still look at, the lens of which they peer through. Thank you for that. That brings me to my next question for Stephen, actually. Stephen, considering what Gordon and David have said, how effective do you think are the U.S. military alliances that, Gordon mentioned, even such as the Mutual Defense Treaty with the Philippines in deterring China's aggression?
Well, there's definitely room to grow. We went through a period where we had a significant presence on the Philippines, and then we closed a major base and we reallocated our forces. We went through a period of moving things away from some of the southern Japanese islands and to Guam and other geographies, and had a defense strategy that looked at long-term strike more than near-in conflict for a time. And so we've had a lot of shifting around, and so have our allies. In an odd way, the Philippines and some of our other allies have really stiffened their spine and resolve recently, not because of an excellent American strategy or an excellent memo written by some genius in our policymaking circles, but because Xi Jinping has actually gone too far in several instances and is provoking a counter response. I mean, I agree with David that in terms of when they're bullying, they're actually giving energy to a coalition that will rally in some ways. And we've seen some evidence of it, but we have room to grow. I think one of the things that Beijing has counted upon and that the broader West has been mistaken in indulging is thinking of this as just the US versus China. That simplifies things in a very unreal way for Beijing. But Japan has invested trillions of dollars in Southeast Asia. That is a counterweight to what China's pittance really is historically in this regard. But China has been much stronger at using political leverage. Japan has usually been shy about that because of World War II history. But the weight of what Japanese infrastructure and other investment is significant. And so if this is an effort of the US and its allies working together to help other allies, not to attack China, but to bolster one another, then it's a very different strategic map in terms of what the balance is. But if it's the US versus China, 1-to-1 on economic or other columns, then it looks very different in some ways as an advantage to Beijing. And so I think that the opportunity is if South Korea, Japan, Australia, Philippines, Thailand, others are willing and able to act a bit more in concert, then ASEAN looks very different.
So this is great. I want to, shift a little bit. It's actually very important to within the topic of discussion, the realm here. Sabah, a Malaysian state, there have been talks recently. Everyone, I think, has been following the recent claims by Paul Cohen, who there's a case there suggesting that Sulu heirs could lease Sabah to China or the Philippines, right? He says these could pose a significant threat. I want to know what you think would be perhaps the geopolitical and legal implications if such actions were pursued. And in fact, in terms of international arbitration, if the Sulu heirs actually were then given the right to lease Sabah to China or the Philippines, what could that mean? And that's open to anyone. David, do you want to take that question? Is my volume working? Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, great. David, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
No, it's okay. Would you like to, or Gordon, would you like to address that? Whoever would like to. So it's a pretty interesting case because even so, for example, Gonzalo Stampa, he's a Spanish arbitrator in this Sulu case, right? And he has been accused of corruption and collusion with a third party funder, which is Therium, right? So it's interesting because we see a lot of, for example, different countries, in Africa, for example, there's a lot of incidents where you find China, even within Iran. You hear cases where these lands are essentially being leased out to for extended periods of time to China, right? So in terms of, just an opinion maybe from everyone here, in terms of the Sulu case in particular, right, with the heirs who are leasing this piece of land in Malaysia to China or the Philippines, is it really a threat? Is there any kind of threat that, for example, the US could consider taking in as a result of this if it were to go through?
Well, there's very
Gordon?
little the U.S. could do, actually. But if land is leased to China, China will tend to think that it is Chinese territory and sovereign because they don't honor agreements, they don't honor leases. So this wouldn't be a good idea for anyone in Malaysia to lease land to any sovereign country. I don't think the Philippines would really be that interested in this, though David may be able to correct me on that. But the point here is that you would think that there would be a lot of pressure brought to bear not to lease land to another sovereign state.
So we hear a lot of, back and forth, a lot of criticism and selective praise for organizations like the United Nations, right? It definitely, the bigger the organization, the more headaches, as we know, and there's plenty of the UN. Considering that, I'm just wondering that if anyone could kind of tell the audience, like with international frameworks in place, like the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UN is close. Could they be better enforced to prevent, further escalation, with China's actions in these areas that geopolitically we've discussed? Do you think they actually could play a role or would willingly play a role to enforce these legal frameworks to prevent, a potential China, escalation?
Well,
If no one else is going to take that, I think there's a very simple answer, and that is no. The UN was not built to basically come to effective solutions when two permanent members of the Security Council were in disagreement. And so where you have China being a permanent member of the Security Council, no, the UN cannot really play a role. We also know that the arbitration of Philippines versus China, the 2016 case that invalidated China's 9-line, now 10-line claims to the South China Sea, China's just completely ignored that. So I'm not sure that you can have a multilateral institution such as the UN or a multilateral agreement like the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea actually be helpful. You would want it to be in a good world, in an ideal world, but unfortunately, that's not the world we live in.
I agree with Gordon, and I think that the only utility of these things is perhaps giving comfort to some of the smaller states in Southeast Asia to feel like that there's moral, legal justification for them to stand up for their claims. But ultimately, this comes down to power. And if you really need a case in point, you can just look at Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We had promised with an agreement registered at the United Nations to protect the territorial integrity of Ukraine if it gave up the world's ultimate weapons. They made the bargain. They gave up the world's ultimate weapons, and their sovereignty was violated, and there's still a war going on. And so that is an example of a P5 member ignoring what that agreement might be, and the United Nations has not had any ability to thwart that effort.
Thank you. David, I know you said you have to go around 6:30. Do you mind if I pose one more
Yes, I
question?
I can have a few more minutes than that, Adele, so that
Thank you. I want to go ahead.
I think the real issue here is raw power. And China now has what, nearly a 350-ship Navy. It has a lot of very good technology. Its missile technology always has been and excellent. It's improving. It now has several hundred fifth-generation fighters, stealth fighters, that has very good air-to-air missiles. There's tons of submarines, and it's building them much faster than we are. We can barely build a submarine a year. China can build several, and so forth. And particularly as the Navy, Air Force, missile triad develops, China's military power, its ability to intimidate people in the South China Sea, will only grow. And their intimidation is always the counterpart of whatever economic incentives they offer. I think a lot of our problem is that we paid a lot of money for legacy systems, which can be defeated by modern technology. And we really need a crash program to defend against missiles and improve anti-submarine warfare and so forth, as well as be able to build submarines. An improvement in the defense industrial base, and I think a Manhattan Project, particularly for directed energy weapons. What we saw in not just the Red Sea, but many situations, is that cheap drones can threaten military ships, and if you have lots of them, it's very difficult to shoot them down with expensive missiles. Use $1 million interceptor to shoot down a $20,000 drone. Technology exists, both laser, microwave, and other, to cheaply and rapidly shoot down missile and drone threats. I think the single biggest mistake the Pentagon is making under the Biden administration is spending less than $800 million a year on directed energy weapons research. That should be an SDI kind of priority thing. I believe unless we can reverse the relative deterioration in our defense industrial base and overcome China's advantages in certain kinds of military technology, China's influence will only grow because, as Mao said, power comes out of the barrel of a gun. So we've got to get more guns.
That's a very American thing to say, by the way, based on actionable items, as we know, all of us here Americans. First of all, I wanted to also address that maybe at DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, which Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy will be heading, we can show them that clip so they can, take heedance from what you're saying. Take heed. I wanted to talk about what you also said, David, quickly. You mentioned that the aggressive side of China is a counterpart to the economic part, if I said that correctly. Kind of they work hand in hand. They use both to balance each other. One doesn't work so well, they go to the other side and then back again. Considering that, let's kind of delve into these whisperings that have been occurring on the global stage, where someone heard, I was told that President Xi had discussed that if, Harris actually does win, I think it was, that they would invade Taiwan. She hasn't won, obviously. Trump has won. But do you think that's something that's on the table still? Do you think that now?
I've been arguing with some of our friends here, particularly with Gordon, for years about this. I don't think China is dumb enough to send World War II style landing crafts across 90 miles of open ocean where they can be chopped to pieces. Taiwan imports virtually all its energy, and it has 3 or 4 weeks storage capacity for LNG. All China has to do is send a cruise missile over the bow of an LNG tanker, and the Taiwanese economy will shut down in 3 or 4 weeks. That'll be the end of it. It's much, much easier and more effective for them to blockade, which they've already done for a period of days than to invade. Invasion, the Navy loves to tell us about defending against invasion because they can come up with a credible scenario for defending against invasion. There's no scenario the Navy can give us for defending against a blockade, given the fact that China has Taiwan and all the waters around it under the coverage of a massive missile shield. So in the case of Taiwan, I kind of agree with Bridge Colby on this. The best we can aim for is the status quo. If China rocks the boat, they'll pay terrible economic consequences. It'll hurt everybody, but it'll hurt them in particular. So they've got a reason not to do anything. And we don't want to encourage the Taiwanese to push towards sovereignty, independence in a formal way, which might cause the Chinese to do that. So that's
Thank you for that.
I think that's where it is. It's really not much more to say about it.
I mean, I don't know if it's quite the same. Maybe it's stretching it a bit to make this comparison, but it kind of does remind me of discussions surrounding, will Iran actually use the nuclear, option? And so I guess everyone's here is thinking, no, they probably won't. But then again, I guess that's a different topic altogether that we can discuss. We should have that discussion too. But I definitely want to talk a little bit more also, if we could delve into going back to what you said, Gordon, the 9-dash line, now the 10-dash line, based on the ruling in 2016 by the Permanent Court of Arbitration that China obviously ignored. I'm just wondering, first of all, if the US went ahead and took that approach and ignored an international, Court of Arbitration's ruling and went ahead and do what they wanted to do, I think there'd probably be a bit of a different reaction than how China's being treated. And that said, do you think that there will be, or what are rather, the long-term implications of Beijing's rejection of that ruling?
Well, clearly it's tarred its image around the world by ignoring the 2016 arbitration decision. And China was able to do that when people thought that China was going to dominate the world. And you go back to the early parts of the Cold War, where the Soviet Union was winning because everyone thought the Soviet economy would overpower ours. But as people started to see the reality of it, there was a different assessment that other countries made. And I think the same thing is going to be true about China. China's economy is not growing at the 4.6% pace that they claimed for the third quarter of this year. It may not even be growing at all. We know that they've got a property crisis for which they have no solution. There's enough vacant apartments for 1.4 billion people. That's a conservative estimate. Some people think the number of vacant apartments can house 3 billion people. So basically, China is going to have to face a reckoning about the way that it has stimulated or overstimulated its economy and created debt. It's going to have its 2008 crisis at some point. We don't know exactly when, but it could be at any time. I think when that occurs, we're going to have a very different attitude towards China's rejection of international norms. Then you're going to start to see countries stand up for themselves. And this is going to be like the end of the Cold War, where people understood how weak the Soviet Union really was. We're going to see the same thing with China as well.
Gordon and I disagree about the Chinese economy and have for a long time, but having been worked on the Russian economy for the first Reagan administration, National Security Council, I can tell you it was not a cakewalk. It wasn't that Russia was collapsing. It was that the United States between 1973 and 1982 reinvented warfare. We created smart weapons. We spent 1.5% of GDP on federal R&D. DARPA invented every single gizmo associated with the digital economy, from optical networks to the mouse to the personal computer to cheap and fast chips. And we did that as a byproduct of winning the Cold War. It was a massive, all-in total national effort, which was incredibly effective. It was the wonder of the world. We're now spending a fraction in terms of the size of the economy on defense R&D of what we did during the Reagan administration. I'm an old Reagan hawk. I think we need to go back to that kind of thing. We haven't done it. it would be, I think it would be foolhardy to sit down and wait for China to collapse. For the real estate crisis, I mean, all China did for 40 years was to turn peasants into semi-skilled industrial workers, and that worked up to a point. And starting 10 years ago, Xi Jinping decided, well, now we're going to go for a high-tech economy, turning that supertanker around and shifting investment out of real estate into industry was an incredibly difficult and messy business. They made a lot of missteps, but right now they dominate telecom infrastructure, EVs, legacy chips, solar panels. They will dominate lower end robotics in a short period of time. China is taking over many of the world's high tech industries, and I think it's very dangerous of us. They can do.
David, your volume, I think, cut out a little bit.
Yes. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to excuse myself.
Thank you.
And Gordon can wipe the floor with me after I'm gone. I won't be able to respond. So I'll leave that to him. And everyone, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us. And we'll have this recording available on the web as well, so you can hear Gordon's reaction later.
Great. Thank you.
Very gracious. Thank you so much. So hi, everyone. So this is definitely an amazing conversation, and I wish we didn't have just 20 minutes left. I also wanted to take the opportunity to just open the floor to any questions anyone has. Please do feel free to submit them into the chat box here, and I will address them to our two esteemed panelists. You know, I wanted to speak a little bit more, focus a little bit more on ASEAN, if I may, with both of you here. It's been criticized for its disunity, essentially, in addressing China's actions. Do you think that ASEAN wants to, or that they are taking or will take any steps collectively to strengthen its response against a perceived Chinese threat? Stephen, would you like to address that?
Well, I think that they're going to, whether we like it or not, look for cues from the United States or other major economies and powers from the outside. I mean, Japan and a few others have been the ASEAN plus whatever number discussers and engagers when they've had these regional gatherings. But really, there's nothing that brings cohesion more than when they feel encroached upon. And so while I respect a lot of the metrics that David was bringing up, the problem that China has is it can only use those once. And if it uses its military power once in a decisive way against the United States or an ally of the United States or even others in the region, all of a sudden the myth that it has been trying to sell, that it is not an imperial power, that it's all just about economic win-win solutions. And if you accommodate with us, you won't have to deal with the hectoring of the United States. You just get richer and there's no real threat. They get to use these elements of hard power one time in a significant way, and the entire vision and reality of the region will change. And of course, if they act decisively in a way that cripples Taiwan, that affects the national interests of Japan and Korea in fundamental ways. And all of a sudden, China's economy and access to the world is fundamentally different, and I think devastatingly different for China. So they have this hard power that I don't think can use other than this encroachment and bullying, which they've done to a fare thee well. But if they do it enough, there will be a unified response by ASEAN to push back at some point, hopefully with American help, Japanese help, Australian help, and others. But until then, we really haven't had the region say that this is more than a sort of concern, not quite yet a crisis.
You know, it's interesting. Gordon, please, if you'd like to respond to that before I make a...
Just to add a point, and that is that ASEAN is a bloc, but inside the bloc, there are basically two different blocs. There are the land states, which have been dominated by China, and there are the South China Sea states, which, as David and Stephen have talked about, have reacted very differently. And you have, for instance, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Indonesia pushing back very hard on China's claims because they're not only expansive, but they are, unsupportable. When you look at ASEAN plus three, one of the pluses is China, but the other two are Japan and South Korea. And both of those are countries which have their own interests, which are diametrically opposed to China's, because China claims part of South Korea's sea, and it wants to lop off parts of Japan. So when you look at ASEAN, yeah, we don't know what it would do at this particular moment. But as Stephen just pointed out, once China starts to go and use its hard power, it probably does unify the bloc to an extent where you see these countries either formally as part of ASEAN or just informally among themselves move and oppose China's interests and its initiatives.
So it's interesting with the military aggression. Since the People's Republic of China was established in 1949, China has engaged in several military conflicts, including the Korean War, which was 1950, 1953, the Sino-Indian War, 1962, obviously between the disputed Himalayan borders between China and India, 1969, the Sino-Soviet border conflict between, in the Ussuri River, Sino-Soviet relations were deteriorated, obviously, and 1979. The Sino-Vietnamese War, right? Which China launched a brief invasion of Vietnam, citing Vietnamese incursions into Cambodia. But in recent years, I could say arguably that China hasn't necessarily engaged in large-scale military conflicts directly. They've been involved in various skirmishes and standoffs. The majority and the crux of their military capabilities, though, and aggression has come through the use of proxies, arguably so, right? They've kind of taken a more veiled approach where they provide the military capabilities to their allied nations. You want to talk about Russia, other countries, Iran, and whatnot. So that it's very interesting. They do, of course, have these border clashes and standoffs, in the sea disputes, South China Sea, and also the China-India border standoffs. I don't know. Do you think that China is actually going to really re-engage like they have in decades past in a full-on military engagement or incursion? If both of you, if I may ask.
I don't think you can exclude that as a possibility. I mean, China is relatively, it may be completely unique in the world in having a dispute with every single one of its neighbors. And so that's, I think, a really tricky set of odds to run, especially if you wanted to have a confrontation all at once around your periphery. But they've mastered the slow encroachment approach that meets with minimal resistance because people don't want conflict. And rightly, they want better lives for their people. They don't want to believe that something as bad as some of these bigger incursions of the past could happen. They may have been told for decades that China was different. It wasn't going to be expansionist. It wasn't going to do these things. And so they might be suspending disbelief. But I think that there's also a glass half full part of ASEAN and where some opportunities might be in the economic realignment area. And while investment from China might come into Southeast Asia and the broader ASEAN bloc, I think that the pressure that started in China, but has been talking about elsewhere in decoupling and reshoring, friendshoring, there's opportunity for some of these supply chains to move to ASEAN. And when it comes to shipbuilding and some other capabilities, the Koreans lead the world in some of these areas and could collaborate in meaningful ways that would change somewhat that economic and manufacturing balance of power. And so I think that there are some glass half full opportunities in this caution and rebalancing period before you get to a conflict that might alter the calculus of all involved. That's the hopeful way of looking at it. Unfortunately, we live every day with the risk that Xi Jinping could push the envelope beyond what we think is rational, and we have to face the reality of a possible crisis.
Thank you for that. Gordon, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I don't think China is ready to go to war. First of all, we got to remember that its military right now is undergoing purge after purge, with the most recent one, a senior member of the Communist Party's Central Military Commission, rumored to have been detained, this Admiral Miao Hua, who is also responsible for picking the defense minister, Dong Jun. And if Miao is in trouble, so is the defense minister. But there have been these wave and wave of detentions of senior military officers. And so I don't think that Xi Jinping is at a point where he thinks he can launch a war. But Stephen's point is absolutely critical, and that is that Xi Jinping can take us by surprise. Right now, only the most hostile answers are considered to be politically acceptable inside of Beijing. And if Xi Jinping provokes another crisis, I don't know if he'll be able to control the escalation. So although China is not ready to go to war, from many different perspectives, it may find itself in a war. And if it finds itself in a war, it's probably going to be losing after the first couple of weeks, which means that they could then start using their most destructive weapons. So right now, this is one of those times where you have the crisis in Ukraine, you could have a crisis in East Asia. Remember, China's waging proxy wars in Europe, which is Ukraine, across northern Africa, and it's behind Iran's assault on Israel. So this is a world that's already aflame, and so anything can happen. So Stephen's point is really important, that we have to be very clear that the Chinese can take us by surprise.
I mean, 1,000 years in isolation, and look how much of a behemoth they've become, right? It makes you think, what are they planning behind the scenes that the outside world doesn't have access to? I guess what you're saying here is that if, right, China isn't ready right now to go to a full-scale war, but if they had the capability, the wherewithal, let's say the manpower to do so, that they absolutely would. Is that accurate to suggest you're suggesting, rather?
Sorry, Adele, I didn't quite hear that.
Basically, if China, you're saying right now, China doesn't have the ability to go to a full-scale war, right? They wouldn't.
It doesn't. And I'll give you, there are two reasons which people don't often talk about. First of all, the Chinese people don't want war. If Xi Jinping decides to go to war, it's not because he wants to rally the Chinese people. It's because he wants to prevent other senior Communist Party leaders from deposing him. So the Communist Party right now is in turmoil. But the second thing is, if Xi Jinping were to decide to launch a full-scale invasion of Taiwan, and I agree with David Goldman, they're not going to do that in all probability. But if they were, Xi Jinping would have to give some general or admiral almost full control over the Chinese military, because that would involve a combined air, land, sea operation, something that China in its thousands of years of history has never done. That would make that flag officer the most powerful figure in China. Now, even on the best of days, when Xi Jinping is most trusting, he does not trust the Chinese military, which is one of the reasons why we've seen all these purges, which means he's not going to give some general or admiral and make him more powerful than he is. That's just not going to happen unless there is some extreme circumstance which we are not aware of.
Wow. So yeah, so exactly. So what you're saying is essentially, I guess he's in a very catch-22 position. I guess even if he were to have the capability, China were to have the capability to go to war, if that wasn't the situation facing Premier Xi, maybe they would. That's kind of what I'm asking. If they could, would they?
I think it would be immensely irrational for them to do that, but we don't have the luxury of assuming rationality. And we also don't have the luxury of assuming sort of individual rationality among the leadership, where you think, not only do I have the ability to punch this person in the face, but I have the ability to survive whatever the response may be and what the response of the neighbors might be. And if you're in a position, as Gordon was describing, of a Xi Jinping that really is just only looking at personal survival and his regime survival, they aren't thinking that second and third order. There isn't a win for the People's Republic of China in going to war with any of its major neighbors or with the United States. The People's Republic of China, as we know it, would end. But a lot of destruction would happen along the way. And so it's not something to be taken lightly at all. But we just don't have the luxury of assuming rationality. So that's why maximizing the capability of capable, independent allies and partners, diversifying the supply chains and manufacturing lines is very, very vital. Do now what we can do now so that you have less risky options and maybe fewer signals that there's a go option, so in the hopes that greater rationality might prevail over time.
I just want to also thank you for that, both gentlemen. I want to also say from Dr. Susan Martin, who is a senior fellow at the Gold Institute, along with myself, she wanted to add a comment slash a question. She said, what is missing from this conversation is a statement of the end of state vision with respect to desired China and global relations, which should guide our strategic thinking. She says, beyond the constant, rather, characterization of China as aggressive and the desire to constrain them. Or I guess in other words, what should the desired outcome look like, and how could the vision, the end of state vision, kind of guide our strategic thinking beyond merely characterizing China as aggressive and focusing on constraining them?
Our vision is basically the same that after the Cold War, and that is a peaceful, stable world where countries compete and their sovereignties are recognized. This is the post-Cold War order, and we want to maintain it. China's vision, though, is very different. Throughout this century, Xi Jinping has been trying to impose China's imperial era vision, where Chinese emperors believed that they not only had the mandate of heaven to rule what they called Tianxia, or all under heaven, but that heaven actually compelled them to do so. And we can see from statements, so for instance, from Wang Yi, the foreign minister, they're very explicit about ending the Westphalian international system that has been in place since 1648 and replacing it with worldwide Chinese rule. And if you think that's ambitious, since 2017, Chinese officials have been talking about the moon and Mars as sovereign Chinese territory. They speak of those near heavenly bodies like the South China Sea, theirs and theirs alone. That's their end state. And it's very different from ours, and it's very different from every other country's. As Steve said, China's in an argument with everybody.
Beautiful. Actually, you're right, they are. And Stephen, you said that they are very uniquely positioned as the only country, I think, that has engaged in some sort of dispute with each of its neighbors. So that's fascinating. Stephen, did you have anything you wanted to add to that as well?
No, I agree very much with the broad direction Gordon was going. The only thing that I would really just add is a little bit of color that maybe addresses the question a bit. I'm really not interested in how to characterize China or the People's Republic of China. What I hope the end state is that the world among responsible stakeholders has developed in ways and decoupled in ways that we move in the direction of responsible stakeholders of this planet and the global economy and the global commons, and that decisions made by a failing Communist Party in China no longer have a decisive impact on our futures. If they want to join and they want to support and they want to engage transparently and with accountability, the door is open. But otherwise, I think that the ideal state is we move decisively among the willing in that direction. And if they choose to stay behind with the BRICS or some other group, that's their choice.
Thank you so, so much. I'm going to just give a few closing remarks here, if everyone is okay with it, to thank our panelists today. I want to just say, as we draw to a vital close, this is vital discussion, honestly, to a close, I want to take a moment and just thank the amazing panelists we had today, the incredible depth and diversity of perspectives that we have been able to be privileged to hear today from David Goldman, Stephen Yates, Gordon Chang, all representing a dynamic tapestry of economic foresight, strategic acumen, and geopolitical clarity. I mean, their expertise that they were able to share with us today really provided us the comprehensive understanding of the intricate challenges and opportunities presented by China's rising influence in the South China Sea. Today's dialogue was not just about a region or a dispute, arguably, it was about the future of global stability. And the South China Sea is so emblematic of the broader tensions being, forced to be adhere to international norms and the power and law, how they intersect. And it really demands that every one of us, I think, step away from today's conversation thinking deeply about what kind of global order we want to shape and sustain. ASEAN, of course, being vital and instrumental in this. Of course, one of the most striking themes of our conversation was the imperative of having a vision, a guiding principle that moves us beyond simply responding to China's assertiveness, arguably, and towards, as Susan Martin said, crafting an end state vision of cooperation, coexistence, and mutual prosperity. I think that our panelists today, of course, have highlighted also the stakes at risk, 3 trillion in trade flows, the fragility, unity of ASEAN, and the profound implications for international law. But more than that, they reminded us that addressing these challenges requires the courage to engage, the wisdom to unite, and the foresight to act. So I want to, again, give my deepest gratitude to all of you, from David Goldman, Stephen Yates, Gordon Chang, for all of you for really your thought-provoking contributions. And I would like to also thank the Gold Institute for International Strategy and its president, Ellie Gold, for hosting this essential forum, and to each and one of you for joining us today, for your engagement. And together, let us, navigate these turbulent, figuratively and literally turbulent seas with purpose, vision, and resolve. Thank you so much, and I wish all of you a very wonderful day and look forward to having you for future engagements. Thank you.